Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for that introduction, Anna. It's really a joy to be here at BALEAP this week and to give this keynote talk today. I'll warn you in advance, I recovered from a cold a few weeks ago, but my voice is still a little bit weak, so if I need a chance to cough in the middle, thank you in advance for your grace. But with that in mind, what I want to talk about today is the value and the place of kindness in our work with all students, but I'll talk specifically about international students, as that's the area where my research and practice is focused. And in doing so, what my aim is this morning is to highlight how many of the approaches or practices that we do with international students by design or perhaps inadvertently tend to center unkindness. And to make that case, I'm aiming to be a little bit purposefully provocative in some of my critiques and assertions this morning, but I very much am welcoming your reflections on them as we get to the Q&A portion at the end. I'm going to start by talking about what do I mean when I talk about kindness. When I talk about kindness, it's probably an act or an emotion that many of us recognize and feel intimately familiar with. And I think many of us probably entered into our professions in higher education because we see ourselves as kind people. We see our work as a space to enact kindness with students. Kindness is something familiar, and perhaps it's something so familiar that we often fail to think about it, what it means or what it looks like in everyday practice. Kindness is, after all, built into the very fabric of our societies. I worked in early childhood before I became an academic, and when I worked in schools with the little kids, the young children would often wear t-shirts like what you see on the screen here. It's cool to be kind. And I think there was a really concerted effort at that age to make kindness a kind of coolness, to impress on our youngest generation about the value and the power of kindness, and making our world and our relationships with one another just a little bit better. And our society is full of platitudes about kindness, things like, in a world where you can be anything, be kind. And while these are really lovely sentiments, they likely have turned kindness into something that's quite generic and elementary. Kindness gets a reputation for being childish in some ways. I have never, for example, in my career as an academic or my work in student services before I became an academic, I've sat through hundreds of administrative meetings and curriculum development meetings and research seminars, and I don't think I've ever heard someone refer to kindness in the sense that I've never heard someone say that what we are proposing or what we are doing is not very kind to our students. So kindness is not something that's often within our check and balance system within universities. We rarely ask ourselves, are we being kind to our students? Is this policy or this practice, is it demonstrating kindness? So I want to give kindness a new PR team, and in my talk, what I want to do is try to reinvigorate kindness and to think beyond the platitudes and the elementary assumptions, to think and imagine what a more radical kindness might look like in our practices. And I'm inspired here by scholars such as Bell Hooks, whose work related to education is often really deeply infused with relationality and care, ways of expressing kindness in a word. And as you see on the screen, or hopefully you can see on the screen, she speaks of how to teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately take place. For Bell Hooks, kindness comes through in the way that we treat each other, in the way that we care for the very soul of one another. And I love that phrase, to care for the very soul of one another. It's thinking about the extent to which we respect the cultures and histories that we bring with ourselves in sharing a space together in a classroom or beyond. So the kind of kindness that I'm talking about is seeing how education is by nature tied to empathy. It's a verb whose action is to care. So when I speak about kindness today, when I get to talking about our practices and our work with international students, I'm speaking about the way kindness emboldens us to see and respect one another's humanity. And as education professionals, I would broaden that to reflect on how kindness allows us to see value in one another's knowledge, the ways of thinking and knowing and being. And this becomes especially important in the intercultural settings where much of our work occurs, thinking about how, through kindness, can we care for one another's souls. So that's kind of where I hope our conversation about kindness can lead us today, taking our understanding of perhaps a more elementary platitudes, beyond those elementary platitudes, towards seeing kindness as a kind of justice and seeing kindness as an ability to respect one another's humanity and knowledge. But in thinking through that, it leads me to also think about the opposite of kindness, about the presence of unkindness. And that's what I'm going to end up focusing on a lot today, is unkindness. Because if we choose to define kindness as a way of seeing one another's humanity, then the opposite must also exist. The failure of seeing one another's humanity and knowledge. For scholars like Paulo Freire, he sees this absence of what I'm calling kindness, this absence of humanity, as oppression. So here he speaks about how an act is oppressive only when it prevents people from being more fully human. And I love that phrase, which he repeats throughout his book, and I'm going to repeat throughout my talk this morning, about being seen and treated as more fully human. Recognizing that a lot of our relations, a lot of the way higher education and our jobs function involves a lot of dehumanization. And our role as educators is to work within these challenging systems to create the conditions where people see themselves and we see people as more fully human. So it's these understandings of kindness and unkindness. Bear with me, I will get to the international student bit next. But it's these understandings of kindness and unkindness that I'm bringing into the conversation today. And what I'd like to argue is that what surrounds us in higher education is oftentimes a lot of structural unkindness, a lot of inability, structural inability, to see and respect one another's humanity and knowledge, a failure to allow our students to become more fully human, and a failure for us in our roles to feel more fully human. So how does that apply to international students? So there's the most obvious of unkindnesses, the kind of things that make headlines. If we look at the United States, where I'm originally from, for example, there's been now over 1,000 international students. The numbers have changed just in the last 2 days since I updated this. Over 1,000 international students in the last month who have been arrested for political dissent. I'm sure you've seen the news, mostly in connection against their political activism against the genocide in Gaza. This is a really shocking turn of events for the international higher education sector generally. That sets a dangerous precedence for their treatment elsewhere. And it might be easy to assume these issues are limited to the situation in the United States, but there are similar unkindnesses in many common host countries. In the UK, there are, for example, 35,000 former international students who are still fighting to clear their names after the UK Home Office decided 10 years ago to make a blanket accusation that they had cheated on their English language tests, despite a lack of evidence of this. There were 2,500 international students at that time deported over this erroneous assumption. So it's not limited to the United States. And these examples are unkind in that they fail to see international students as human beings and fail to recognize how these actions have lifelong consequences for their lives. Our immigration systems often do not treat international students as more fully human. but perhaps more connected to our roles. A lot of my recent work, as Anna kindly introduced, has focused on evaluating the state of research and practice related to international students. And you might not be too surprised, my view of the field is a very critical one, and that I see a lot of our work and our research related to international students as based in good intentions, but ultimately very flawed. I want to speak about research for a moment, and the body of research that includes international students as participants or co-researchers. Research with international students, it's a burgeoning subfield of higher education research over the last 2 decades. There have been thousands of research articles that have been published about international students and their experiences across various academic disciplines. And over the last 5 years or so, I've been working with a number of colleagues on a few different projects which have incorporated some systematic literature reviews aiming to try and synthesize the state of existing knowledge within that field. And across these projects, I and my co-authors, we've read and we've evaluated over 1,500 published articles about international students. It's not a methodology I recommend for the sense of sanity. And I think our original intentions had been to bring together this huge body of research to identify good evidence-based practices for supporting international students. But what we quickly found was that this task was impossible, and that the limitations within existing research made it impossible to synthesize. And we talk about this in much more detail in our articles. But one of the reasons for this was the problematic way that international students were repeatedly positioned within research in ways that are fundamentally unkind. The most obvious of these were the way that the field, both in research and I'm going to argue in practice as well, overwhelmingly functions through deficit framings of international students. What I mean by that concept, deficit framings, I mean there's a tendency to describe international students in terms of what they are assumed to lack. They aren't good writers, that their language is poor, that they aren't critical thinkers, they don't participate well in class. The list goes on and on. We hear these in our practice. I would often argue international students are one of the last groups that it is seen as socially acceptable to speak about them in this way. If we replace international student with any other subgroup of students we work with, we would quickly see that as very biased language. So international students' presence in higher education is often presented as a problem or a challenge that needs to be overcome. And we have an entire field of research, and in practice I would argue as well, which is predicated on fixing students' perceived deficient skills. What you see on the screen here, this is just a small sample of some of the work that's been published over the last few years. And I've purposefully only included titles, not the names of authors, because I see this issue as not perpetuated by individuals. I think individuals come at this with the best of intentions, but sometimes this language is so endemic and foundational to this area of work that it creeps in even amongst our most critical colleagues. And this is a narrative I'm very critical of, because I see it as fundamentally unkind. It's an unkindness which is fundamentally oppressive. It's unkind in the sense that it positions international students as inferior students. And we see that in some of our Daily Mail headlines, where their knowledge and their skills, they're assumed erroneously to be of lower quality. And there's often an inherent coloniality to this lens, which positions the practices within students, or the practices within our host countries, which are frequently in former colonial powers and Anglophone or Euro-American contexts, as somehow more correct or more academic, while students and their skills are often taught to see their existing knowledges and practices being positioned as lower quality or inferior. And these practices are then perpetuated in other contexts. So there's this inherent othering quality to how international students are often positioned in research that then trickles down into practice, creating this us versus them narrative that has come to define many of our institutional practices. It begs the question, as we sit in this EAP context, the notion of whose English belongs in academic practice is a question that was on my mind yesterday through our conversations. And much of this unkindness comes from a limited recognition that many of the processes we value in education of writing, rhetoric, critical thinking, referencing, and the like, these are all culturally rooted practices which are contextually constructed. I'm going to use the example here of the way we teach school-age students to write. Now, this is a bit of a risk, because I know someone in this room has a greater knowledge of me than on this topic. But it's a purposefully simplified example to make a wider point. But I'm going to use the example of how we teach students to write, and I want to compare structures of writing commonly taught in the UK with the case of China, and I choose China as an example as the context where the largest majority of international students in the UK currently come from. So here's my purposefully oversimplified overview. So writing structures, of course, are taught variously. But in the UK, particularly in England, for GCSEs, for example, a common method is the IBC approach. That's what I was taught in the US as a child as well. Or a good essay is one which includes an introduction with a clear thesis statement, a body of paragraphs that provides evidence for that thesis, and then a conclusion which summarizes, again, the arguments, the essay's key argument. So it's a rather linear and tight approach to rhetoric formation. But that's just one way and one approach to organizing an argument. And if we look at the example of China, we find some subtle variations. So a common approach in Chinese education, such as through teaching argumentative essays for the Gaokao, provides an introduction which may imply a main argument rather than directly state it, followed by paragraphs that develop and slowly build this key argument, at which point there might be a twist or a turn might be introduced, which typically offers a counter-argument or a counter-example to balance the point being made, to show an alternative devil's advocate perspective, where finally the key argument is solidified and clarified in the conclusion. Again, rough and rudimentary. If you have more knowledge of this, please show kindness to me. But I think it's an example of how there are culturally different ways of approaching a similar educational task. And this is just one example of many different approaches to different tasks that are brought into higher education by students from different backgrounds. Thank you. But what we can see is how when students have been taught along one of these lines, and they bring with them their culturally rooted understandings of approaches to things like writing into another context, our gut reaction when we've been trained differently is to assume that this is a poorly written essay. And we can see where within the UK, a lot of the common feedback that Chinese international students receive about their writing come from. So common things like their argument is unclear, their paragraphs lack focus, their twists are too unconnected to the key thesis statement, their conclusion brings in too many ideas. How many of us have given this advice to the students we work with? But what I want to argue is their writing isn't deficient, it's simply different. It's a different way of approaching rhetoric and writing based on their cultural and educational histories, which vary from the context in which we might be teaching. And I think this is where kindness starts to get really tricky. So what is most kind in this situation? On the one hand, do we help students leave their cultural history behind, kind of in recognition that it's likely going to impact their marks? So do we help them instead to adopt the styles of rhetoric and argumentation that are valued here? which can make them most successful in the context where they're studying. But my question is, what's the human cost of that choice for students' understandings of their knowledge and the knowledge they bring back with them if they return home? Might we instead recognize the inherent unkindness in positioning their cultural ways of knowing and doing as inferior, something not good enough that must be changed? Is it perhaps more kind to try to transform these structures to be more interculturally inclusive of alternative mechanisms for things like writing? This is just one example of a wide array of potential unkindnesses. Because so much of our work in universities comes from this integrative lens, which asks students to leave their cultural baggage at the door. This is something I'm very critical of, and I've recently written an invited essay in the Journal of Studies in International Education, where I'm arguing against deleting that term integration from our language as practitioners and as researchers. Some of the reasons why I'm critical of this is the ways that it is dehumanizing, a type of what other scholars have called cultural suicide or epistemicide. It also positions host environments, positions them on a pedestal as places worthy of integrating into. That their knowledge and values are somehow greater than the ones students bring with them. And it places an unjust onus on students to fix themselves while ignoring structures of inequity and unwelcome which exist within the context where we teach. So notions of integration, it leads us to question. If we get rid of this phrase, it leads us to question the problematic structures that exist within our own society and our own ways of teaching within institutions. There are, for example, hundreds of articles focusing on how international students make friends, pointing to their limited friendships with home students and positioning their existing friendship networks as a deficiency. But I can only think of a few which turn that question on its head and ask, why are home students not being more welcoming to their international peers? So again, we place that onus entirely on international students without questioning the structures which are impacting their experience. So unkindness, it presents itself through the field's inability or at times unwillingness to address these structural barriers which create or exacerbate what we often then read as deficiency, assuming the problem is international students themselves. And these kindnesses, they're noticed and they're felt by international students. And this becomes most apparent when they're given a platform to share their voices about their experiences. So following our work analyzing the research on this topic, we wrote a book called Research with International Students, which we aim to use as a call to action for the field to create more critical approaches to research which humanized or conducted research with rather than on or about international students. And we wanted to practice that by including as many international students as possible as authors within the book. And so for one of the chapters, we did an open call for international students to co-author a chapter together about how the label international student impacted their experiences. We ended up with 5 international student authors. They were spread across the world. They had never met before, but were suddenly asked to write this chapter together with limited prior publication experience. On paper, it should have been an absolute disaster, and we felt we were taking a significant risk by introducing this task. But they wrote this beautiful chapter, and I can highly recommend reading their words, where they highlight the detrimental impact of feeling othered in the classroom and through research by being labeled international and encountering assumptions about what that meant, what kind of traits they were assumed to possess. Because the impact of these unkindnesses are so great and they make such an impression on our students. When we talk about the dip in international student numbers, their dehumanization and sense of unkindness is a huge factor in the shifts and changes of international student numbers globally. And if we look across platforms, we see a really common thread through international students' voices. That is ones of hurt and disappointment, feelings that they are not being seen as more fully human. So what do we do, I think is the question. As professionals who work most closely with this population, what I argue is there's a need for us to consider how we might change the narrative from the ones which see international students as those who need to be fixed. How do we move away from that narrative? And a better narrative is one, I would argue, that recognizes the knowledge and linguistic heritage that international students bring with them into higher education and questions the system and structures which deny their equal contribution or reduce their ability to be treated or to feel as more fully human. One approach that I advocate for is shifting our perceptions of existing challenges away from critiquing individuals towards investigating structures. So for example, a common thing that I hear from lecturers and practitioners is something like international students are not very critical. I can't tell you the number of times I've heard that from lecturers. But we can take that statement and we can flip it on its head to approach it ever so slightly differently. And when we do so, it changes what we intend, the actions we intend to take. So moving away from students as problems towards structural considerations. In the next few slides, I'm going to show you how you can approach that, I think, through one of two ways. I give a lot of trainings in universities and departments around the country and internationally about how to rethink our work with international students. And the reactions I get, I think, are often along a continuum or a spectrum. So I'm going to show both ends of that. So depending on your approach or your practice, some of you might be working with the urges to burn it all down and radically reimagine education. Surprise, surprise, that's the side that I feel comfortable with. But I recognize that might not be the space that suits everyone, right? Activism needs different forms. And some of us might hold faster to established education values or skills and prefer to instead think about how to develop more inclusive approaches that maintain these existing values we hold dear. And I think both of these approaches are perfectly valid, and you can probably feel as I'm speaking which end of the spectrum, and I can tell maybe by some of the faces in the room, which end of the spectrum you feel most aligned with and where your approach likely sits. And I'm going to show you how these differ. So, for those of you who feel more comfortable with retaining existing approaches, I think at the very least, we can recognize that there is kindness in acknowledging that existing structures may not make clear the approaches to things like criticality that is expected when students arrive at their study destination. This might be a bit small for our low screens, but what is on the screen is an example of a marking rubric for the research methods unit that I've taught on in the past, where criticality makes up 25% of the final mark for the assignment. I'm competing with the rain now. But if we look at the rubric, what we have in it is very vague language, right, about the presence of criticality within an essay. And I can see how if students are to look at that rubric, they might find it a severe challenge to enact criticality without a clearer understanding of what criticality even means in this context and how it's expected to be presented. So I think we can take that original concern, international students are not being very critical, which is an unkind statement, which paints their skills in a deficient lens and fails to recognize their own cultural heritages of criticality. And we can shift that instead towards recognizing that our understandings and expectations of criticality, at the very least, might not be very clear. And this immediately gives us action points, right? Rather than fixing students to make them more critical, it leads us to thinking about, can we remake this terrible rubric to provide more details? Can we embed into our teaching more explicit reflections and discussions about what criticality means for this assignment and within this context, and how it's expected to be performed? So the elimination of uncertainty becomes a kind of kindness. If students need to be critical to be successful, then at the very least, we can identify what we mean by being critical, especially a concept that is so challenging to define. I think if I went around the room, every single one of us would define criticality in a different way. So we're setting students up to fail if we don't have a clear recognition of what we're expecting. Particularly in an intercultural context where notions of criticality might not be shared. Perhaps, though, you feel the more radical approach coming on. Perhaps you're like me and you want to instead question the very structures of why we approach education in the way we do. Why do I think criticality is what it is? Where does that come from? And we could make that shift even further by recognizing perhaps our existing approach to assessment is insufficient for valuing diverse approaches to criticality. Perhaps we want to instead entirely remake our assessment, like the Lego we see on the screen. Tear it all down. Maybe we want to remake that from the ground up towards something more interculturally inclusive, questioning how we might be able to incorporate diverse approaches to critical thinking into this task. Perhaps we want to redevelop our marking scheme entirely, completely, restructure and question how criticality and whether criticality is assessed and what place it holds in that marking scheme. So it's a different kind of kindness. One that doesn't just make structures more visible, but actively works to dismantle and transform them to allow students' knowledge to be recognized more strongly within them. So as I come to a conclusion, what I hope my talk has outlined is that unkindness is presented in various ways, in the way that our sector frequently works with international students. And I think as EAP professionals, you likely find yourselves wrestling with these unkindnesses most acutely, because you're reflecting not only on how to make your own teaching more ethical and more kind, but you're also finding yourselves on the receiving end of unkindnesses elsewhere in the university through people who are making assumptions about your roles or making assumptions your departments are the places where problematic students get fixed. So I want to end the presentation by thinking, how do we move from unkind to kind? As my voice gives out on me. How do we infuse more kindness into our practices with international students? How do we ensure that our practices contribute to seeing students and their knowledge as more fully human? I think I don't need to say out loud, there are deep concerns facing our sector in very uncertain times, concerns which require collective reflection and consideration because they are so structural and so unfixable alone. So I don't want to pretend that I have all the answers, and I thought instead I would end with a series of questions that we might ponder as we go throughout the conference. So what do we feel are the most grievous unkindnesses present in our institutions and our practices? And I raise that because I think many of us have nagging concerns in the back of our minds that certain aspects of how international students are being treated isn't quite right. And it's that little voice that I'm encouraging all of us to listen to. And in listening to that voice, it leads us to ask, how do we ensure international students are being seen as more fully human at our institutions and through our practices? And maybe I'd add to that by saying, how do we ourselves feel more human through our practices? Because there's so much in our work which is unkind to us as well. And finally, how do we move practices away from fixing individual deficiencies through that integrative lens towards dismantling structural inequalities? If any of that resonates with you, I end by just sharing a few resources to continue these discussions after the conference. The first, for those who are research active, as Anna kindly introduced at the start, I organize a network called Research with International Students, which develops resources and events which aims to encourage more ethical and anti-deficit research with international students. You can find us just by Googling Research with International Students, and we also have a page on LinkedIn and on Blue Sky. And the final thing I'll say is that I'm connected to an international network for practitioners in various roles whose work focuses on internationalization, very broadly defined, and that's called the Internationalization Practitioner Network. We meet online once a month and share different approaches to supporting international students or working in intercultural contexts on a very practical level. So if you've got examples of good practice to share, or you would like to get some feedback on resources you're developing, or you'd just like to connect with others working in this area and hearing what they're doing, you can join the mailing list by scanning the QR code on the screen. I'll leave that up for a moment, but I think with that, I look forward to your thoughts and comments. Thank you so much.
Wow. Thank you so much. I actually feel a little bit emotional. Yeah, great stuff. And we are very welcome for your questions, thoughts, reflections. Anna and I will be running around with mics, so if you have something that you would like to share with Jenna, please just give me or Anna a wave. I always think it's a good sign, Jenna, when the crowd is silent, it means you've got them thinking.
It allows my voice a moment to recover. Thank you.
We've got a question over here. Over here.
Hi, Jenna. Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and I feel for myself really convicting, even in my own practice. And I know I've heard, I'll be honest, myself say those things. Oh, there's a challenge with writing, there's a challenge with critical thinking, and reframing it from that perspective of, you know, there's something wrong with our approach. It's really, really, really helpful, and will definitely challenge me and my team. My question is, I suppose a lot of this comes from an institutional level as well. So how can we as EAP practitioners encourage our institutions to think about these endemic structures and ideas? And have you any suggestions of where we could start? Thank you.
No, I think that's a really great point. I think justice only works if it works across different levels. And that goes beyond higher education as well, right? If our employers are expecting certain problematic things, then our work in higher education is always going to cater to that. So there's a wider system and structure that needs dismantled. I think one of the challenges, and I think some institutions are better at this than others, in a lot of institutions, EAP sits over here, and the rest of the institution practices are over here. And students get kind of shoveled into EAP to go find help. And I think the more we can dismantle and create bridges between those two, the better. I've seen some examples. The specific institution, of course, is escaping my mind at this exact moment. But one of the practitioners in our network spoke about a service their EAP was providing where they would go into the classroom, they would observe the teacher, and they would look at their assessment materials, and then they'd have a half-hour meeting to discuss, here's how you might construct your practices to be a bit more interculturally inclusive and to connect more with what we're teaching within our department. Now that only works if it has resources. I can see some people thinking, oh my God, I don't have time for that. But this particular institution, they resourced it. They hired more people to be able to offer this service across the institution. So I think for me, it's building bridges. It will never work if EAP is over on a cliff and it's just a place to shovel students. Is my gut reaction. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Jenna. I saw you do a CPD at Birmingham last year and remain as persuaded as I was then. I was thinking about this deficit narrative, and I was wondering if you ever find that is also needs deconstructing sometimes within the students themselves because it's so ingrained. You know, that question of, is it kind to try and teach them to start doing things in the way that's valued here? And is there also a question of, I think often I'm telling my students that you aren't bad at this and this is just a different way of doing it and it's just the way that's valued here. And so it's so kind of insidious that it sort of needs deconstructing within the student body as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And there's been research on this. Again, exact things are going to escape my mind at this moment. But there has been research on this about how students internalize deficit framings because they are so structural. And they hear time and time again about how their language is poor. So they begin to think, of course, my language is poor. And so I know within my work with students, I often hear students who are apologetic in a way of, I'm sorry this essay isn't very well written, or I'm sorry my language isn't very good. And I think it's questions of that need deconstructing as well. But those only exist because our structures are oppressive. So I think we've got to fix the structure. But in the meantime, I think we've got to dismantle the internalization as well. So that's a great point you raised. Thank you.
I've just got a couple of questions coming up on the app, which is going to throw me completely, but I'll just go through the couple that have come up, if that's okay. So, wonderful talk, thank you, from Anonymous. Should we consider why international students choose to study in the UK or the US? And should we also ask the question of how, for example, US or UK students at overseas institutions are expected to integrate or conform to the structures of those respective cultures?
Yeah, great question. So I mentioned I do a lot of trainings around the country with departments about how to rethink practices with international students, and that question comes up 9 times out of 10. I think in almost every workshop I ever do, there's the question of, well, don't students come here because they want to learn about our pedagogies? And one of these days, I'm going to do a research project, or if there's someone in here that needs a new research project, please go in that direction. Because we've got very limited evidence about this. I mean, there's been hundreds of papers that have been published about students' motivations for studying internationally. There's been meta-analyses and systematic reviews of that work. And I can't think of any, please correct me if you've done this work and I'm wrong, but I can't think of any that highlight that one of the pull factors for students is learning about our pedagogic approaches. And I think we probably have an over-conceited feeling about the value of our pedagogy and how much it matters to students. But I think it's an excellent question for a future research project, or questions within the programs you work with in terms of talking to students about how much of that actually matters to them. It's an answer I'm not sure of, but I'm skeptical of. The other question about UK students studying internationally, of course, I think a lot of these issues still exist outside the UK and US, but I think we also have to keep in mind the power dynamics of our global structure of knowledge, and that's if you go to places like China and Hong Kong, for example, they're using Cambridge English examinations. So there's a hegemony there of global structures of knowledge that exists that I think we have to be mindful of, that also need dismantling.
Shall I just ask the second one, and then we can go back to the floor if that's okay? So this is from Dr. Saima Shirazi. He says, the very premise of why we educate and how we educate is brought into question by your thesis. What Freire refers to as the banking model of education, where students are perceived as empty vessels. So you could be right, we need to break it down and start again. So perhaps more of a comment than a question, but...
Yeah, I think I am questioning the entire structures of education. And I think I'm questioning it in the sense of what is the point of international education? So I think a concern that I have is what is the point of our work? If we're working with students who are coming from other countries, we're teaching them how to do our way of education, the vast majority of them return home. What was the point of that exercise? And I think that to me is a question that is, as a practitioner, on the back of my mind and the students I work with. What's the point of what we're doing? And I don't have the answer to that.
Okay.
Sorry, just in response to that, many years ago somebody said to me that what we're doing in education is we are manufacturing units of labour. And I was absolutely appalled. But I am aware that many Chinese students, and I work a lot with Chinese students, they come here because it increases their work, their employability, and that is their major motivation. So I think, in many respects, I'm with you, but at the same time, we have to kind of acknowledge what it is that they want from it as well.
Yeah. No, I think it's a good point. And I think that's not just an issue for Chinese students. I think that's all of our students who are worried about employability. I think that's part of what I was trying to say earlier, that if we dismantle education, that only works if we also dismantle employability. And I think there's a real question here. Sharon Slot, for example, in Finland, she did a presentation for our Research with International Student Network recently, which was talking about how do we shift from employability to employerability. And I think we've got to get employers to ask these same questions. And it's a societal, I'm a radical, burn the whole society down and start over. But yeah, I think our dismantling of education only works if the society itself is ready to hear it. But I think that isn't a reason to stop trying. Yeah.
Okay, so it's 10 o'clock, and I just want to thank you again for a really thought-provoking start to our day. I think I might have a T-shirt printed with "Burn It Down."
You can
We'll see how that goes. We'll see how that goes. So if we could thank Jenna again.
Thank you very much.
So we've got half an hour for discussions on your tables, for teas and coffees, and if we could move over to the Babbage building just before 10:30 for our morning sessions. Thank you.